more attention that way. You're a good teacher, though, I'll tell you.
Oh, easy with that. Okay. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
How are we?
We good.
Oh, howdy.
Here they are. Hey.
Come on in. It's not.
We were talking about you all this morning. Oh, no. Well, we were looking for you this morning.
Oh, okay. We were watching the water tower out there. What are they doing?
They are replacing the cell phone array because we're T-Mobile bought Sprint. So, yeah. We are on the camera though. So I'm sorry. I'm going to jump right into it so that the people watching on YouTube are like, what are they talking about? This sucks. So we talked about it last week, and we are doing the Feast of the Holy Family today. Christmas is Saturday. There's a whole bunch of Christmas readings. We've all read those readings so many times, and we, as wonderful as they are, this way we can at least get it to be a little something different and a little to look over the horizon to a celebration we don't always focus on as much. Feast of the Holy Family, it kind of comes in on, I don't know the history exactly, but it used to be we had Epiphany, the baptism, the presentation, the circumcision, and the Feast of the Holy Family during Christmas. And it was just a really wild time. And they've kind of, after the Second Vatican Council, they smushed a few of those together and they spaced them out a little bit so that it would be easier. Of course, we know Jesus was circumcised within 8 days of being born. We know they took him to the temple after 40 days of being born, but that wouldn't have happened in the Christmas season. The baptism, it's a lot to get through. So we've spaced it out. And we're focusing on the Holy Family today. The first reading, we have options. So this is one of those feasts that give you options. I took the liberty of deciding the option that I thought was just funner to dig into. So the first reading we're going to do is the book of Sirach, chapter 3, verses 2 through 6, and then they skip a couple of verses 12 through 14. Are we on top of that? Do we know where that is?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, in that case, could we have someone volunteer to read?
Okay.
All right. Can you step up to the lectern, Kathy, because I have it mic'd up there.
Sure. Excuse me. The reading of Sirach, chapter 3, verses 2 through 6. For the Lord sets a father in honor over his children. A mother's authority he confirms over her sons. He who honors his father atones for sins. He stores up riches who reveres his mother. He who honors his father is gladdened by children, and when he prays, he is heard. He who reveres his father will live a long life. He obeys the Lord who brings comfort to his mother. The word of the Lord.
Oh, keep going.
Oh, you want me to go on?
Verses 12 through
Oh, you
14
want me to,
as
okay.
well.
Okay. My son, take care of your father when he is old. Revere him not as long as he lives. Even if his mind fail, be considerate with him. Revile him not in the fullness of your strength. For kindness to a father will not be forgotten. It will serve as a sin offering. It will take lasting root. In time of tribulation, it will be recalled to your advantage. Like warmth upon frost, it will melt away your sins.
Kathy. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, there's a Bible up here. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Any thoughts or feelings on that?
Boy, times have changed. That's the way I feel about it. I wish that children today, not even children, but kids that are in their 20s even. I wish they showed more respect and love to their parents. And I don't see that much today. And I found that very sad. I love this way, how they say that. And your prayers will be answered. And it's so true. You know, when you love your parents and take care of your parents, and God hears you, you know. But when you treat them like they don't matter, I'm not saying God doesn't hear you, but I think he's slower to answer sometimes, you know what I mean?
I don't.
And I
I know what you mean. I'm hesitant to say that
I
though,
know, and
to be
it's
honest.
just my feeling.
Well, and I like how you talked about nowadays, and that's probably more of a can of worms than we have time to open this morning. But one of the interesting things, Kathy, is we do have to consider this reading in its cultural context. It's real easy for us to project this into how we live today. You know, honor your father and mother and take care of them. It's one of the reasons it's not as easy today, or more easy or not as easy, it depends on the circumstances, is that we're living in a different family culture than they lived in ancient Israel. In ancient Israel, you lived in family homes,
Yeah.
4 or 3, 4, maybe 5 generations deep. Today, you know, it's rare that you see more than 2 generations living in a home.
Very.
Not entirely rare, but you know, it's the trend or the model is there's 2 generations in a home at once. In this cultural context, your father or mother is there, your sisters and brothers, well, your brothers and their wives, and your kids and their kids are all there. So it puts a big difference on how that family dynamic plays out. And one of the big differences there is that even though you're a full-grown adult, you know, if you can be 50, 60 years old, still be living in your parents' house, and you do not have control over your own money or your own affairs. Your parents do. You have not inherited your land yet. Your parents do. And so you're really living in a situation where, despite being an adult and maybe being in so many ways in the prime of your life, especially your mental prime, you do not have control. And that's something that we're used to, you know, in our day and age. By the time you hit your 20s, you have total control of your life.
You earn that.
So,
Correct, Andrew? You earn that control, basically. After so long, you know, you work, a lot of them lived on farms and lived off the land, and you worked together.
well, we'll get there.
Okay.
We'll get there.
I wouldn't hear
The idea of charity atoning for sins, this is very interesting because it says more than once, you know, if you love and revere your father and mother, it atones for sins. In some ways, there are spaces in the Hebrew scriptures where it alludes to this idea. In the book of Tobit, it alludes to this because Tobit does this, but a good act atones for sins. And that plays into a little bit of what we do now in the church. When you're looking for forgiveness, you do an act of penance. You take a physical step. You do an actual thing that rights some of the dysfunction that you've brought into the world with your sins. There's another element though that I think in this, and that comes in when it talks about the older parents. With the older parents, it goes very much into say even when his mind fails. Now, if you think about that in the cultural context, when you're living in a multi-generational house, the oldest male is in control and the oldest male is going senile. And the oldest male is making all the economic decisions still. The temptation to kind of push them aside is going to be massive. And you know, think of it in terms of like the prodigal son. The prodigal son comes to his father and says, "Give me my inheritance now." We tend to think of that guy as being like a 20-year-old. The prodigal son might have been like 40. So, it's a little bit easier to have some sympathy for, yeah, I could imagine wanting to be impatient at that point. You have by all means earned your keep, or you're an adult and you're still living under mom and dad's roof. But even when his mind fail, revere and honor them. That has to be so hard. Today, when we have a parent whose mind fails, and I haven't had to bear that cross yet, we get a little bit of distance, we get a little bit more control. We help them manage their affairs. They likely live in a different place. It's really easy to go and be charitable to them. But when that person still has authority over you, that has to be incredibly hard. I think both that the charitable acts aspect, and especially when the relationship is difficult and you're subservient to something you don't quite understand or you think you know better, what hits me in that is like, what a model that is for your relationship with God. We always talk about that we use the father and sometimes the mother imagery for God, but we use that in like the cute, heartwarming way, right? The 4-year-old kid and the daddy and the mommy and all that. In this context, though, when you're talking about an adult living with a parent who might not always be on the same plane, who you have to submit your own adult capacity and authority to this person, I think there's really something there with what we deal with God now too, because we don't always understand what God is doing. We don't always agree with the way God is running the world, and it's so tempting for us to think like, we know better, we could run things better. And we make those decisions every day of trying to control God's world and do that against the idea of trusting God and revering God, even though we are so tempted sometimes to look at God and kind of act like God's gotten a little senile. God, why are you letting so-and-so get away with that BS? And so I wonder if maybe that's part of it. Maybe that helps you cultivate the attitude toward God where you will receive forgiveness better, because you have this more mature relationship with authority and family. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to point out was verse 5. It says, "He who honors father and mother is gladdened by children." Now, it seems kind of a give and take thing, but I think there's also an organic nature to this. He's gladdened by children, and when he prays, he is heard. And we'll think of it in the other way. If you're living in a home and you're reverent to your father and mother, one, you're giving your children an example so they will do that to you. So yes, you're going to be gladdened by your children. And two, if you're reverent and respectful and you're modeling that with your family, like when you have to go ask father and mother for something, you're learning how to pray. Just the organic nature of it feeds into your relationship with God. And, I don't know if that's the point Sirach's trying to make, but I see that and I think that's really cool. Any other thoughts, questions?
I have one question. How long does the child, like the son and his wife, how long did they live with his parents? Do they have a certain number of years that they have to live in the home with them and then they can move out, or how's that go?
I can't say that I know for sure, but I would want to say they live with the parents, basically the parents' whole life. And I'm not sure, but like when you look back at Genesis, like Isaac lives with Abraham until Abraham dies, and Jacob lives with Isaac until Isaac's so old that he gives him his blessing right before he dies. I would want to lean toward that, but I'm not sure. So the psalm, blessed are those who fear the Lord and walk in his ways. Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine in the recesses of your home, your children like olive plants around your table. Okay, this psalm is written by a man for a man, obviously. But he's looking at the family as a blessing and an expression of God's love. Blessed are those who fear the Lord and walk in his ways. Behold, thus the man is blessed who fears the Lord. You will see prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. In the ancient world, when they don't have as good an idea of an afterlife, this is the best thing God can give you, is children to carry on your line. And not only in a material sense it is the best thing God can give you, but in a spiritual sense too, because the family is such a model, such an icon, such a gateway to the spiritual relationship with God. So a very nice thing for us to sing back and celebrate as we take in these readings. The epistle is St. Paul's letter to the Colossians, chapter 3, 12 through 21. It's a little bit long, but it's also very good. Anybody want to read it? Mary Ann.
Brothers and sisters, put on, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, heartfelt compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving one another, if one has a grievance against another. As the Lord has forgiven you, you must also do. And over all these put on love, that is, the bond of perfection. And let the peace of Christ control your hearts, the peace into which you were also called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, as in all wisdom you teach and admonish one another, singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs with gratitude in your hearts to God. And whatever you do, in word or in deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Wives, be subordinate to your husbands, as is proper in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and avoid any bitterness toward them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this is pleasing to the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, so they may not become discouraged. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So there is a lot there. Was there any word or phrase that jumped out at us? Yeah, Janet.
Forgive one another as the Lord has forgiven you.
Mm-hmm.
And then, don't harbor grudges and all that stuff that goes along with forgiveness. No grudges and all that. And then let the peace of Christ control your heart. That's hard.
Yes, it is.
Not easy.
Well, and I'm glad you pointed out some of that from the beginning, because that gives us a little bit of context. So St. Paul writes this letter to the Colossians. What scholars think is because there is, as in many of Paul's letters, there's kind of a Gnostic, ascetic, dualistic strain of theology that's getting into the community and it's causing trouble. There's kind of in like chapter 2, he talks about if you died with Christ to the elemental powers of the world, why do you still submit yourself to regulations as if you were living in the world? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. These are all things destined to perish with use. They accord with human precepts and teachings. When scholars look at this and other stuff, they think there's this really rigorous, ascetic, almost overly structured theology going around, where people are kind of denying themselves earthly pleasure in a kind of extreme disciplinarian way, and they're going through these really complicated like spiritual exercises, worshiping angels or other kind of earthly powers. They're not sure, but it seems like there's something, and Paul is trying to get beyond that. He's trying to get beyond the legalism and asceticism to a more embodied spirituality, because people are kind of tempted back in the old days, and we still are too regularly here, where it's like you neglect your body, you neglect the world you're living in to focus on the spiritual reality. And Paul says, when you do that, you're kind of actually playing into the dysfunction in the world rather than healing it. When he's talking about forgiveness, love, and peace, it's really easy to see how that's the sort of stuff that doesn't flow very well when you're living in a total institution or a very tight, disciplined system, because you're probably pointing the finger at yourself and pointing the finger at other people really easily. And peace, by the way, this is maybe a system that focuses on negatives, that people are kind of falling into this mindset. Peace is a positive. Peace is the presence of God, not the absence of strife. He goes on and he, encourage and praise each other in all your actions. And he focuses on the actions. Do the actions for God. Don't focus on what you're not doing. Focus on doing what you are doing for God. And in all of this, then it plays into the family, because he talks about the family structure, which people were wondering about in the early days of Christianity. Is Jesus coming back? Does family count anymore? Paul wrestled with that in some of his other letters. And Paul said, I've chosen to not start a family because I want to focus on Christ. But he also tells people, if you feel called to start a family, start a family. He doesn't want to shake down all the worldly institutions. He wants Christ to fill them. Now, when he talks about the family, the first thing he says is, wives, be subordinate to your husband. Don't throw stones at me, please. This is not coming from like a blatantly misogynistic state of mind. This is actually coming from the general societal understanding of family at that time, which was a little misogynistic, but it was not as some people would say, designed to degrade women or designed to subordinate. The philosophers at that time, they looked at how family structures tended to play, and they had this idea of a pater familias, which existed in Rome, and that would be like the godfather, the great patriarch of the family, and you'd have a household. The patriarch would run it. He'd conduct the affairs. The wife would be more on the domestic side of things, and the husband would be more on the external business side of things. See, you can imagine where the external business, getting involved in politics and all that stuff, would cast the illusion that the man comes first in the order of how things work. And so he says, wives, be subordinate to your husbands. And subordinate just means ordered below or ordered behind. in a societal structure in a lot of ways. And that's because, Christians were wondering, how much are we revolutionizing society? Are we tearing everything down, or are we filling everything with love? And St. Paul wanted more to say, no, fill everything with love. Don't tear everything down. And that's a constant thing we struggle with in the church, is where do we have to struggle against the ways society is working, and where do we just have to fill it with love? But he says that, and he also doesn't demand it. He said, do that willingly. He doesn't want to live in a system where wives are violently subordinated. He wants to live in a system where wives are going to be in the order of society and do that in a way that's humble and meek and self-giving, not self-debasing, but self-giving. He goes further and he says, husbands, love your wives and avoid all bitterness toward them. The word for love that he uses, the Greek word agape, the strongest word for love. It's not romantic love. Romantic love is eros, where we get the word erotic from. It's not philia, which is brotherly love, where we get the, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. This is agape, which means a self-sacrificial love. That was new in society. The idea before, especially in the Greek and Roman culture, which was kind of misogynistic, was the husband's in charge, the wife is below, the husband calls the shots. He's saying, husbands, you need to be willing to sacrifice everything for your wives out of love. That's new. He talks about the children, be obedient to your parents. This is flowing from what we read in Sirach, right? Obedience to parents, one is they've been around the block, they know more than you, and two, it's such a model for our obedience to God, such a jumping off point. And then they go to the children too, because he's coming from this very patriarchal society where the dad says jump and the kids jump. And there's some societies that are kind of like that nowadays, where the family, if they go to McDonald's, the dad orders for the whole family. Doesn't ask what they want. He knows what they want or what they need. He's saying, no, encourage them, build them up. And we get a sense of a whole family that's living in a societal order, which does have a few picadillos here and there, but a family that's living for each other and building each other up, not trying to dominate each other, not trying to put each other in their place ever, but to build each other up. And then I can't resist saying it, but St. Paul's coming, this philosophy of the father is the head of the family. What's My Big Fat Greek Wedding? The mom says the father is the head, but the wife is the neck, and she can turn the head any way she wants. So I just always thought that was cute. Any other thoughts or?
Do you know, for example, like with many of these Middle Eastern countries that depend upon the Quran, does it put forth this kind of idea of the husbands being very loving and self-sacrificing, or do you know?
I have not studied the Quran. I've seen like a couple YouTube videos where people have tried to point out verses in the Quran where Muhammad modeled a sense of really lovingness towards wives that kind of overshadowed any sort of societal strictness division of the sexes, but I don't know very much. Yeah.
I mean, the image that we get from the media is that, the father was sitting at it, and I just didn't.
Yeah, and we do get an image where it's kind of like a false dichotomy. If the father is completely in charge, then the mother is kind of treated like garbage. I don't know if that's always the case. I was watching a 60 Minutes about Saudi Arabia, and they have like at Starbucks, there's a family rooms, like not everybody sits in the same room. And one of the women they were talking to, they're like, well, this is privacy for our family, So it's one of those things. There's certainly like incredible room for horrible, horrible dysfunction and abuse in there. But to say that that's necessarily the case is probably not fair on our part. But I also think that we might be striking a better balance, but I don't know.
What's the difference between the Torah and the Quran?
The Quran is the Muslim scriptures. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, which is the basis for the Hebrew scriptures. And Muslims believe they believe the Torah, but they think that the Torah was there's some sort of corruption or mistranslation has been there. So they say if we can find the original Torah, that would be part of our scriptures, which is interesting. Are we ready to go to the gospel? Okay, the gospel is Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. The first 2 chapters of the book of Luke are massive, and that's because they're talking about Jesus' infancy and how all of Jesus comes about. Anyone brave enough to read? Now, is this your choice, Elaine, or is Kathy making you? Okay. Oh, I saw you pointing.
I saw the finger. A reading from the Gospel according to Luke. Each year, Jesus went to Jerusalem for the Feast of Passover. And when he was 12 years old, he went up according to the festival custom. After they completed its days, as they were returning, the boy Jesus remained behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Thinking that he was in the caravan, they journeyed for a day and looked for him among the relatives and acquaintances, but not finding him, they returned to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were astounded at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been looking for you with great anxiety." And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. He went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. And his mother kept all these things in her heart. And Jesus advanced in wisdom and age and favor before God and man. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Jesus Christ. Thank you, Elaine. We have all heard this one before, right? Did anything hit us new this time hearing it? I'm not seeing anybody, so I'm gonna guess we're kind of still contemplating. Well, let me point out just a few things, and then we can keep jumping and play with it. The Feast of Passover, we all know what the Feast of Passover is, right? Comes from the book of Exodus, where God goes through and all the Hebrew children they're kind of struck down, which mirrors both the idea in the ancient world that you're supposed to sacrifice your firstborn child to God, and it also kind of is this poetic justice when they tried to kill all the firstborn Hebrew children. But anyway, this is the central liturgical feast of the Jews experiencing God's salvation when it came in history, and they experienced it again and again. And they take Jesus to it every year, the gospel says. which is really awesome. One of the more important point here is it says he was 12. Why is it important to say that he was 12?
Because that's a kid. He shouldn't be on his own while his parents are gone.
Well, even more, he was 12, which means he was a kid. Hebrew boys, when they turn 13, what happens? Bar mitzvah, they become a man. Jesus is still a child in his society. He is not able to take care of himself. He does not have the responsibility. He has no one looking after him. So when he goes missing, it is a big deal. If he had been 13 and gone missing, he probably could have been liable to some sort of judgment because he would have been held responsible for his actions. So it's kind of interesting it happens now. So this is what we call a childhood narrative or an infancy narrative. They notice they don't see him in the caravan, and they keep going for a day. Oh, he must be with the friends and relatives. I really enjoy that image because it tells me that Mary and Joseph were not helicopter parents. Isn't that nice to know? Like in a sense, they did respect Jesus, that he would play with his friends and relatives. He was well socialized. He wasn't hidden from the world. And, today we have a lot of kids who are hidden from the world to the point that it's kind of unhealthy. And that they did have friends and relatives, and despite whatever hardship they had, they were members of the community. One of the things we teach in the church is family is the basic unit of society, but we're also called to community outside the family. And so I love how that's both there. And they go and they see him in the temple, and he's sitting among the scribes and scholars, and he's giving these really good answers and questions that no kid should be able to give. That one is interesting to me because he's 12, which means his mind is probably open to abstract thought, but still he's somewhere way beyond his experience level. And Mary, of course, is, why have you done this to us? We've been looking for you with much anxiety. And it's one of those moments where we want to look at Mary and say, oh, come on, Mary, you're better than that, right? We hold you in such esteem. But it's also a very human, motherly thing. Like, why would she expect Jesus to have stayed in the temple? But he kind of says, well, duh. He says, I must be about my Father's work, or I must be about my Father's business. He says, this is who I am. Don't you know this? This is my place. This is my Father's house. There's two translations, by the way. One is Father's house. I must be at my Father's house. And another is about my Father's business. Both of which come from that kind of Greek idea that there's household business and the Father runs the household and runs the business aspect of the household. But he says, I must be. This is who I am. And we talked about it last week. Because when Mary visits Elizabeth, it's another moment where it's not that Mary didn't understand or didn't believe or was doubting, but it becomes so much more real right here, doesn't it? Coming and finding Jesus and seeing him identify himself with God as Father in the Father's house. I don't think Mary would have denied that had someone said it to her before, but really seeing it in the flesh has to take her aback. So she goes and she ponders it in her heart. But there's also this really interesting dichotomy, because Jesus says, I must be here. This is my Father's house. He's putting on display pretty formally, my identity with God really transcends your motherly anxiety, Mom. Like, my identity with God transcends all of this stuff. Like, you're all upset because you couldn't find me. I'm so beyond you looking for me.
Must have hurt.
it probably wasn't easy. And Mary, she goes back and she ponders that in her heart, though. She doesn't get, I know plenty of mothers who would have just, slapped the kid upside the head. But she ponders that in her heart and works it out, and carries that tension with her. But there's still, he sees her in distress, and he also goes with them to Nazareth and is obedient to them. Jesus he's literally in the place where he belongs. And once again, he comes down from that place to live among his family and live in the society and to be obedient to Mary and Joseph. I think, like, when I read that, the humility popped up so much, because the whole idea is that Jesus is God and he came down to be with us. And here you see Jesus in the flesh, in the closest to God that any Jew could possibly be, in the temple. And he goes back to Nazareth with his mother and father. Really humble, really humble. And he's obedient to them, which means he listens to them. Where before, he was listening to the teachers and asking them questions. And he's willing to put that aside and go listen to his mom and dad, who are uneducated. And then I think that's where it goes about, and it says, and he grew in, oh boy, let me make sure I get this right. Jesus advanced in wisdom and age and favor before God and man. Both of those together. It means a lot that he was willing to advance in wisdom and age and favor before men, before humanity, by going back with Mary and Joseph to their little podunk town and being a good son. And that, I think, is part of how he grows in favor before God, too. And part of maybe how all of us do, is by being good, listening to our parents. And even though we might feel we have a right to transcend this family on earth because we're looking for a family in heaven or anything like that, even if it's kind of not such a noble reason, we find that God isn't necessarily calling us to the heights directly, but to bring the heights down to the family that we're in. Anyways, sorry, I'm trying to get a little too mushy there. Some common threads, and these Gospels all play together really nice, don't they? It's pretty direct. It's Holy Family, and everything's about the family. It talks about a household, whether that's this ancient Jewish household where everyone's living and Grandpa can't remember what day it is, but he's still the one who gets to decide how much you sell the corn for. Or if it's this household in the Greco-Roman sense, where there's kind of a strict model where dad does all the business. Or this household where Jesus is saying, like, no, the temple, this is my Father's household. But still living in Mary and Joseph's household. There's a challenge in all of these readings, how that becomes a place of encounter with God. Whether it's being humble before your parents, so that it teaches you to be humble before God, and it teaches your children to be humble before you and God, or whether it's taking a societal structure that could very easily be really, really hierarchical, and basing it, not tearing down the hierarchy, but rearranging that hierarchy about love and building each other up. The idea of obedience comes in a lot, especially children to parents. The idea obedience, by the way, it comes from the word obedere, which means to listen. Obedience doesn't just mean, like, do what I say, but actually hear me when I say it. And there's there's plenty of good discussions about that among the friars a lot. But one of the things St. Francis said is a real obedient friar, he's going to be like thinking about what his superior would want from him without the superior having to say it. He's ready to listen, to really hear what it's all about. And that has a place in the family. First of all, really listening, and second of all, acting upon what the other's needs are, especially if the other is in a position to be a little wiser than you. And as a husband, I'm realizing very quickly that wives are often in the position to be a little wiser than us. And then the last bit is the honor, the favor, the building up, the love. That's what it's all directed toward. Jesus advanced in wisdom and age and favor. The father who honors his children will find God's honor coming in forgiveness. And that's what it's all about. That someone said, and I can't remember the exact wording, but they said the family is an icon of God. The family is an image of God through which we can experience God. And if we live our family, if we live in that household in a sense of obedience and honor to each other, it basically gives us a lens to see God. It gives us all the things are coming together where our relationship with God can blossom through our relationship with each other. That's about all that struck me, at least. But if anyone else has thoughts or questions or ideas, shout them out. I'd love to hear them.
Is Obadiah Latin?
It is Latin. Yeah.
I have 2 points. At the end here where he's obedient to his parents,
Mhm.
once again, he goes with
Right.
peace, which is, that was the reading yesterday. Jesus is peace. He didn't argue or anything, so. And then, it's interesting to me that nobody ever, even though they spend time with Jesus, they don't really get it. The apostles didn't get it, Mary and Joseph didn't get it, because it says, but they did not understand what he said to them. When he said, don't you know I must be in my Father's house? They didn't get it.
It's well, and that's an interesting one too. The ancient Jewish idea of you call God your father is more of an adult thing to do. It'd be like the king would be referred to as God's son, but a 12-year-old cannot be king. And they, in a sense, they don't get it, and nobody gets it. And actually, in Christianity, we didn't come to the point where we thought we got it until 400 years later, trying to draw out and explain and sketch the mystery of God becoming man. Mary and Joseph might not have understood what that meant all the way. They really might not have. St. Paul was starting to figure it out when he was writing, or he was starting to articulate it, but even today, it's too much for us to, it is too much for us to understand. And I think Jesus meant it to be that way. He meant that encounter with him to be this weird amalgamation of meeting God and another human being that wasn't super totally clear, but at the same time was really, really powerful. I don't know. Yeah.
This feast always kind of makes me wonder what day-to-day gritty life is like with Jesus growing. I mean, we don't know, but I don't know. I just kind of tend to think that he was God, and so everything was easy. But he was a human being like everybody else. But there had to be something I don't know. I'm just saying, it makes you wonder.
It does, doesn't it? And it's there's some non-canonical, non-inspired scriptures that attempt to go through and talk about Jesus' childhood, and they are wild because they portray Jesus as this kid was very obviously God at age 3, and he was like talking about stuff that no one could understand and doing miracles. And there's one where he's like a 6-year-old and he's making these like clay birds by the riverbank, and a bully comes and kicks him over, and he like zaps the kid and kills him. But they read that and they said, no, that's a little much. Like it didn't happen like that. It was kind of mysterious. Everybody must have seen something very special in him, but not been able to tell that they saw it. I don't know.
And another thing that struck me as you were talking, it was the way you had the pause in there. God, Father. Godfathers. Godfather.
I did not mean to do that, but maybe there's. I was thinking it.
Wonderful inspiration.
I was thinking of it like the movie The Godfather, and Marlon Brando is in charge of the whole family. That Italian model is descended right from the Roman model that Paul is looking at. But yeah, and
Technically, your godfather should be like God. Father. And I think,
Mhm.
I know this is a generalization, but I think a lot of people, I got to have Godfather, or my God, there's really no support, let's put it that way.
when I was working in the parish, that was one of the things we were trying to figure out how to do better, is get the godparents to take it seriously. And we can probably jabber on about that. People at home are going to get bored. I'm going to end the video now, but there's a Godfather conversation probably coming. So.